Hello, everyone. It's about that time now. My name is David Holper. I'm a member of the Secular Student Alliance. This is our president, Maggie Capehart, right here. She helps set she basically wants to set this all up. Before I get started, let me tell you a little bit about our group. We are a Secular Student Alliance. We are a pro-secular group or a pro-science group, separation of church and state. We're one of the most active members on campus. Recently, we had a blasphemous stand-up comedy we did, which happened to be on Good Friday. That was a complete accident, though. Some of the things we do, we work with many groups here on campus. We've worked with pagan groups on campus. We've worked with what other groups?
The Muslim group on campus.
The Muslim groups, and something we want to emphasize is that we're a group foremost for secularism. And, whether you're a religious person or not, that secularism is a value that anyone can, embrace. It's the belief that no religion should dominate another. It's the belief that there's no, fundamentalism is incompatible with Western values, Western culture. And Dan Barker has been so kind to come. We're extremely honored. He is by far the highest profile person we've had so far. So so I won't take up any more time. Secular Student Alliance proudly presents Dan Barker.
Well, thank you. I'm the co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation in Madison, Wisconsin. We're a national organization. We're celebrating our 40th year this year. We became a national group in April of 1978, and we started with just 2 people. We're growing, and we have now a staff of over 25. We have 9 full-time attorneys and a legal staff, and we work for 2 things: to keep religion and government separate, and in that endeavor we are often joined by religious people who agree with us that the government and the church should be separate. But our second purpose is to educate the public about the views of those of us who are not believers, the nones, the non-theists, atheists or agnostic or secular humanist or igtheist or whatever you call ourselves. We all disbelieve in the same God, so that's one of our sayings. We're not exclusively atheistic, but I think 80% of our group call themselves very happy atheists who know how to be good without God, who think, by the way, that it's easier to be a good, moral, productive, meaningful person with joy and purpose in life without submitting to some lord or master, but by submitting to reason, to kindness, to human altruism, and to good human values. So it's a blast. I used to be a preacher years ago. I preached for 19 years, and I won't do a sermon tonight. You've heard enough sermons in your life. I was Reverend Barker for 19 years. And did you know the word reverend is a typo? Did you know that? The first letter was originally an N. You get it, right? I guess once a preacher. I guess once a preacher, always a preacher. But this is the funnest job in the world, to be able to travel and meet people. Last night I was at Moorhead over in Kentucky, and they have got a great growing group of freethinkers, the Secular Student Alliance over there. And this is part of the Secular Student Alliance as well, right? So the Secular Student Alliance is a national organization of student groups, campus groups. It's kind of the secular alternative to Cru or InterVarsity or Baptist ministries on campus. An organization for the non-believers, people who are happily without faith. And it was fun to talk to them last night. And I brought a whole bunch of books and things to sell, and they almost cleared me totally out. So I only have like 2 of everything left here tonight. So you can find this online if you want any of these materials. I do have some free things: a free newspaper, Free Thought Today, which is published 10 times a year, and essay contests. There's 4 student essay contests here. You can pick up one of these. If you're a good writer, you could win some money for your college. First place in each one of these is $3,000 cash. Second place is 2,000, 1,000, it goes on down the line. And then we also award honorable mentions. So if you have any writing talent at all, enter one of these. There's one for college students, one for high school students, one for graduate older students, and then there's one separate one for students of color who could enter about what it's like being a non-believer as a student of color in this country. So please take one of these.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, Dan, the winners often show up at the national convention, is that right?
Sometimes, yeah. And we reprint the articles in the newspaper.
In the newspaper, yeah.
So, and I want to encourage you to enter because we get hundreds and hundreds of entries, and most of them are kind of crappy. I have to tell you that. About 80% of them we look at, they don't put much work into it, and they just want a chance to win a scholarship. So if you have good talent, your chances are pretty good that you'll be up in the top rung of writers. And we have a staff that goes through them all, and Annie, Lori, and I get to judge the final entries. So please think about entering. We want to encourage free thought and reason and science among young people. And it's kind of exciting because this generation now is less religious than it's ever been. You students here in this group, you probably don't know historically the perspective. 30 years ago when I started doing this, I could count maybe 5 or 6 or 8 groups around the whole country. Maybe a group at Harvard or maybe a secular group. Today there are hundreds of them, and it's a bottom-up kind of thing. It's not like some church hierarchy is, planting all these ministries, secular ministries around the world. It's the students themselves saying, hey, we got to form something. How did you guys start? Did somebody come on campus and missionize you to lose your faith? Or was it just you, right?
Yeah, it was just us. Rob came up to me.
Mhm.
Yeah. So that's cool. That's the way it should be. It should be bottom up, people thinking for themselves, just like the American experiment. Originally, there were all these constitutions and governments that were top down, like a monarch or a king or a royalty. But our country flipped it upside down, and the highest authority in our country is we the people. It's a bottom-up kind of a country. And free thought is a bottom-up kind of thought rather than a top-down. Tell me what the Father wants me to do. Tell me what the dictator wants me to do. Tell me what Allah or Yahweh wants me to do. I'm going to think for myself. And when we do that, we find out that people, on average, who think for themselves are pretty good, decent, smart, moral people. So it's to your credit that you started a group like this. That's pretty amazing. There's a piano here, and I play the piano. So let me do a couple tunes, and then I'll talk about, what am I talking about today? God, God the most unpleasant character, right?
Yes.
Okay. This is a tango, and Annie Roy suggested I pick the tango. She's my wife, and she's co-president, because the tango was a musical style that the church had outlawed. Did you know that? The church said, don't dance the tango. It's sinful, it's sensual, it's seductive, it's wrong, it's demonic. So of course, what did everybody want to dance? That was the best way to make a style popular. And this one is called Beware of Dogma. Beware of dogma. It wants a fight. Beware of dogma. It has a bite. Beware of dogma. It will ignite a holy war by itself. Beware of dogma. It'll trap your mind. Religious dogma. It'll make you blind. Beware of dogma. It's not designed to let you think for yourself. If we let it out in the universe, there will be no doubt everything is worse. Beware of dogma. Don't let it loose, that unchained dogma. It'll reproduce. Tie up your dogma. There's no excuse for ignorance anymore. Beware of dogma. Don't let it loose, that unchained chain dogma. It'll reproduce. Tie up your dogma. There's no excuse for ignorance anymore. Please clean up after your dogma. So we have 3 full albums with about 50 tunes. I'll just do one more today. One of the very first songs I wrote after I left the ministry in the 1980s, talking about the fact that in order to sell anything, especially salvation, if you want to sell salvation, if you're going to be an evangelist or a missionary, half of your job isn't selling salvation. You have to convince the person that they need what you're selling. A good salesman has to convince you, you need this. Half of your job is selling damnation. You're trying to convince people you're rotten, you're bad, you're a sinner, you're going to go to hell, you're going to be punished, aren't you? You need somebody above you. And then if you can convince people of that, you can get over that hump, then you can say, but guess what? There's an answer in Jesus or in Allah or whatever. There is a salvation for you. So I kind of liken it to a doctor who runs around cutting people with a knife so he can sell them a Band-Aid, right? Like, and that's kind of like what religion is. You're bad, you're horrible. And Christianity especially, but a lot of the other religions have this horrible pessimistic view of human nature. We're just rotten. So I thought, wait a minute, that's not right. I think that's totally upside down. So this was written about 1985, I think. It's called You Can't Win with Original Sin. We cannot win. No, you just can't win. So, music, I think music makes the world go round. No matter what culture you're in, there's never been a human culture that hasn't had music of some sort. And church music, of course, is gorgeous. A lot of it's boring and dumb, but some of it's actually gorgeous music. Some church music is inspired by real human feelings, and a lot of church music actually was written by atheists. Did you know that? Ralph Vaughan Williams, who wrote a lot of the hymns in the English hymnal, he was an atheist his whole life. Although his wife said as he got older, he converted into a happy agnostic. So, people do change. And a lot of the classical music and a lot of the songs that we listen to were written by people who were free from religion, who just enjoy life, who appreciate beauty and music and love and all of that. And I want to tell you, we're going to start working on, I haven't figured out the title of it, an atheist gospel album. Maybe we'll call it Godless Gospel or just New Gospel or something, with some former gospel musicians, mostly black gospel musicians, who are now atheists and agnostics, who are tired of the phoniness, tired of the dishonesty, and they want to get involved and really do real solid music. So this year we're going to start on a project called Godless Gospel, which is really going to be a blast. I think we have a church where we're going to be able to do the video in, so that should be fun. Maybe we'll start off singing an a cappella with the robes and then take the robes off and then just start, and one of the funnest things for me a couple years ago was I got to co-write a song with Charles Strauss, who's the Broadway composer who wrote Annie, the musical Annie, and Bye Bye Birdie and all that. He's a lifelong atheist. So he said, send me some lyrics in and I'll set them to music. So we wrote a song called Poor Little Me. Maybe when we're done, I'll play that song for you tonight. So, last night I talked about this book, Free Will Explained. That's what they wanted to hear. It's mostly the philosophy students that wanted to hear about this. We just came out this year. The book that came out before that is this one, God, the Most Unpleasant Character in All Fiction. And I understand you had somebody here a month ago talking about defending the genocide in the Bible or something. Was it something like that?
Yeah,
Right.
the Russia Christie
And anyway, it's a big topic. And, the Old Testament has all this ugliness in it, and God's killed and murdered and pestilence and all that. And so how does that square with him being a God of love? And of course, it doesn't square with that. This book is kind of an accident. Not the back to the front. This book kind of an accident. The scientist Richard Dawkins, who wrote The Selfish Gene back in the 1970s. And by the way, if you read The Selfish Gene, which was recently voted the most influential science book of all time, it even beat out Darwin. The Selfish Gene, if you read that, it's all about genetics and biology. But right in the middle of The Selfish Gene, there's a couple of pages of Bible criticism, of all things. Why would a biologist and a scientist writing about science have some Bible criticism? Well, Dawkins has always cared about these things. He's always thought about religion and the Bible. And of course, his big blockbuster, 2006, The God Delusion, that he wrote, which it's great. It's powerful. But Dawkins admits he's not a Bible scholar. He's a scientist and a biologist. And so he gets slammed by believers a lot. He gets slammed by theologians and apologists who say, you don't know what you're talking about. In The God Delusion, there's one sentence that he wrote that's been more criticized than anything else Dawkins has ever written in his whole life. One sentence. The first sentence in chapter 2 of The God Delusion. Did you bring your God Delusions with you today? Let's turn to chapter 2, verse 1, and we'll read together. That first sentence, and maybe I can't quote it exactly, but it's basically like this. The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. That's how Dawkins described the God of the Bible, the God of the Old Testament. And people really have jumped on him for that. How can you say that? You're not interpreting it right. You don't understand he's the God of love. Why are you saying that? You obviously don't know what the Bible's all about. The chief rabbi of London called Richard Dawkins anti-Semitic for saying that sentence. And later, to his credit, he backed off and said, well, no, he's not being anti-Semitic. He's just being anti-Yahweh, anti-character of the Bible. So Dawkins is trying to defend himself for that one sentence. And in 2014, he contacted me and he said, I'm working on a slide. He wanted to make a slide, like a PowerPoint, except he uses Keynote. I use Keynote too. I think Mac and PCs are kind of like Protestants and Catholics. You have to pick one of them. And so we're both Mac people. And so he was making a Keynote slide, a spider diagram, where the middle of the slide would have the God of the Old Testament as arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. And then 19 spider legs going out for each of those 19 nasty adjectives in that sentence. And so that you could click on, for example, you could click on ethnic cleanser, and then out pops a Bible verse. You shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land, for I have given you the land to possess. That's ethnic cleansing. And so he said, can you find the Bible verses for me? And I said, sure. So we started working on it, and there was 19 of them. And after a while, there was a lot of verses. Some of you know what the Bible's like. Jim Hott here has written a lot about the horrors of the Bible, right? Do you all know Jim Hott, the editor? Are you emeritus now?
Yeah.
Of the Charleston Gazette, right? In Charleston. And he's got some really good books on that as well. So you know that there's an awful lot of material in the Bible. There are some verses in the Bible that say God is love. There's no doubt about that. There are some verses that say God is love. But how does a small handful of verses that say God is love compare with the thousands of verses that show just the opposite? Show a God of anger and a God of wrath. So after a while, the verses started piling up, way too many for a slide. And then somewhere in there, Dawkins says, you know what, Dan? This would make a good book. Pun intended. He said, you should make a book with one chapter for each of those characteristics. And I showed that email to Annie Lawrence. She said, hell yes, that would be a good book. So I started working on the book, collecting the material. And to Richard Dawkins' credit, he said, let's go careful here. Let's not go overboard. Let's not just put everything in, because let's just put in the stuff that's really clear. We don't want to be accused of overreaching, you know what I mean, to make a rhetorical point or something. Just pick the stuff that absolutely fits. So it took 14 months to work on the book. I get up early, like at 4 or 5 in the morning. I love to write early in the morning. And by the way, in this next book, I talk about how I made friends with one of the squirrels in the backyard through that, which got me thinking about free will, but that's a different story. But during the process of writing, I found out that Dawkins was absolutely right. So part 1 of this book is called Dawkins Was Right, and there's 19 chapters, which each of those adjectives that I just described. But I found some that he forgot or left out. There's more. Maybe he didn't leave them out. Maybe he just thought 19 was enough. But so part 2 of the book, I have 8 more. Pyromaniacal and cannibalistic and aborticidal, verses in the Bible where God commands and commits abortion as a punishment against the people, ripping up pregnant women because they didn't follow the right gods. And so these 8 more in part 2, I'm calling it. Part 1 is Dawkins Was Right. Part 2 is called Dawkins Was Too Kind. So so that's, what is that, 27 total in the book of characteristics of the God of the Bible. The first time I gave a talk about this was at the Tucson Book Fair, which is pretty amazing. University of Arizona, or Arizona State, which is it in Tucson? One of those. And we had our booth there at the book fair, and to get there I walked past the Gideon's booth. You all know who the Gideons are? People who put the Bibles in the hotel rooms, the Gideon Society. And these 2 guys, they weren't just staying in the booth, they were coming right onto the sidewalk, handing Bibles to people. And I said, oh, the Bible. And he said, yeah, you should read it. It's the bestseller. The Bible's the best-selling book. And I said, it might be, but it's probably the least read book as well. People don't actually read this book. You know, it's in the hotel rooms. It's in their homes. You hear a few verses, you know, from the pulpit. But do people actually read it? And he said, oh, yes, we read it. It's God's word to the world. And I said, oh, really? Okay, well, then tell me, what do you think about the story of Phinehas in the Old Testament? He went, Phinehas, the story of Phinehas. And he looked at his friend. I thought you told me you read the Bible. Do you read the Bible? There's a whole chapter in Numbers 25. There's a whole chapter about Phinehas, about this man, what he did. What do you think about him? They didn't know, right? In fact, there's a whole bunch of stories you can bring up and mention. What do you think about this? What do you think about that? And most of them don't know. Once in a while they do. There are some Bible students who study it and read the whole thing carefully. But most believers don't. And these guys really hadn't read it much. To them, the Bible was like bibliolatry. It was like a talisman thing. We need to have the Bible without paying any regard to what it actually says, what is actually in the book. So I explained to him, well, Phinehas was a priest under Moses. He was the grandson of the high priest, Aaron. And Phinehas was a righteous priest. And God had told Moses that the Israelites should not mix with the Midianites. You should stay separate. And this is in my chapter about racism in the Bible. There's a lot of racism in the Old Testament. And so the Midianites were anciently also from Abraham, but they were south of the border, kind of a different group of people. And the Israelites all through the Bible are being told, don't mix with them and don't mix with them. Don't marry these people. Don't intermarry with these people, which is a kind of ethnic cleansing, isn't it? Just keep your race pure. Keep the race like God wants it to be. Keep the Israelites pure. And yet, you know what happened? You know what kissing cousins are like, right? Love is love. So one man fell in love with a Midianite woman, and he brought her into his tent. They were named Zimri and Cosby. And this was breaking God's law. You should not intermarry with these people. Imagine if there was a law like that in our country right now. Imagine if there was a law. You can only marry these kind of people that are in your group. Some religious cults are like that, and the Israelites were like that as well. So, what did Phinehas do? Some of you know the story now, right? Now that I'm talking about it. Did any of you go to Sunday school? You remember the story? You don't? Okay. Well, Phinehas picked up a sword. He went into the tent and he stabbed both of them to the belly, and he killed both of them. He killed a mixed race couple because of his zealous righteousness for God's commands. What if somebody did that today? What if some minister, priest, pope, rabbi, or somebody was really angry because some American Christian married a Canadian Buddhist and said, you can't do that, and went in and killed both of them? Wouldn't that be a hate crime of the highest order? What do you think happened to Phinehas in Numbers 25? What do you think happened to him?
He was praised.
Well, basically, he did get a promotion. He was praised. God, through Moses, praised him for his zeal for protecting the purity of the Israelites, the purity of the race. He was praised, and he was given a perpetual priesthood. He did the right thing by obeying God. Obedience of the dictator earned him a place of high honor. There are all sorts of stories like that, and I think that is horribly immoral. I think that's a story of immorality and depravity in the Bible. And yet when I was a preacher, I used to say, well, those were tough times back then, and God identified himself with a nation, and anybody who stepped outside of that, and anyone who made it impure by marrying with those bad people south of the border, they're the wrong people. They had the wrong God. They worshiped the Baal Peor God. That's how dictators control. That's how big men control the tribe, by saying we all need to keep together. So there's story after story after story of killings that are praised, genocides. There's a whole chapter on misogynistic, which is pretty much a thumbnail history of how the whole Bible treats women. And even today, many of our modern laws are based on some of those archaic patriarchal stories of how women were property, even in the Ten Commandments. When you read the Ten Commandments, the last one says, thou shalt not covet. By the way, the Roman Catholics have a different ordering. Did you know that? They used to. Right? They changed it. They used to take out the second commandment about graven images because that prohibition against graven images was appearing on graven images, which was weird. So they took that out, and they took the number 10 and they cut it in two. If you see a Ten Commandments monument somewhere, see if the second commandment says graven images or not. If it does, it's a Protestant version of the Ten Commandments, like you see in a lot of courthouses around the country. If it doesn't, it's a Roman Catholic version, at least a 1960s Roman Catholic version of the Ten Commandments. So in the 10th commandment, or if you're Catholic, the 9th and 10th commandment against coveting, women and wives are lumped in with the property that you should not covet. You shouldn't covet your neighbor's oxen or jewels or wives or slaves. Women were like wives and slaves. Women were property in those days. And of course, that's the kind of culture they were writing from. Women were property. They were a measure of a man's wealth. Women and children were a measure of how big and powerful a man was. And you even see that today in Islam and other Abrahamic religions, where the women are this secondary. I used to preach, well, a woman has her place, but man is the head, right? Because that's what Paul said. And Paul even said, if you accept all of those epistles as being genuine, Paul even said that women should keep silent. You don't learn anything from a woman, you learn from the man. So there's some real blatant sexism and misogyny in the Bible. Although there were a few female characters in the Bible who stood out, there was actually a feminist in the Bible. You know who that was? Can you think there was actually a feminist woman in the Bible? Queen Vashti in the Old Testament. The story of Esther, remember the story of Esther? Where the king said he wanted to parade his wife to show her off before all the men what a beautiful wife he had. And she said, no way, I'm not doing that. And so guess what happened? Well, the Bible doesn't say what happened to her. She just disappeared from history. Who knows what happened to Queen Vashti? And so Esther was chosen to take her place. And Esther would be this obedient woman who actually rejoiced in killing 50,000 people because the king said, you can have whatever you want. She was bloodthirsty. And the next day the king said, so were you happy about that? She said, yes. Can we kill some more? She said, let's kill some more. So I don't know why the Jews celebrate Purim, because they're celebrating a mass murder type of a person. But in any event, there's all this misogyny and sexism and patriarchy in the Bible. And even the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. If you read the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, on its face it looks like it's anti-homosexual. And it is, actually. Because the Bible is very homophobic. And by the way, right there, that should tell you something. If the Bible says homosexuality is wrong, then the Bible's wrong, not homosexuality. Why can't we use our moral judgment to decide whether this book is worthy of our admiration morally? Well, is it good just because it says it's good, or is it good for good reasons that transcend the religion? But in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, actually, and I didn't really realize this until I read back through it again, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is actually part 2 of a 3-part saga. It's the middle part of a bigger story. The first part of the story is when Abraham and his wife Sarah were told by the traveling angels and God that she was going to have a son and he would be the father of the new race. And she laughed. Remember that whole story? And but do you know where those men were headed when they were telling that? They were on their way to Sodom when they stopped off at Adam's tent to do this thing. And as they went on to Sodom, then Abraham was following God, say, hey, how many people would you destroy the city of Sodom? Would you knock it to 50? Could you make it to 10? Could you make it? That whole part is part 1 of that whole saga, right? Part 2 of the saga, the men arrive at Sodom. And then you know that whole story of Sodom and Gomorrah, where Lot offered out his daughter to be raped by these men rather than these. How inhospitable is that, really? To want to rape my 2 male angel guests. Here, take my daughters instead. And so then the city was destroyed in fire and brimstone, and they barely escaped, and the mother-wife turned into a pillar of salt and all that stuff. That's part 2 of the saga. Part 3 of the saga, you know what that is in the Bible? After that, what happened to Lot and his daughters?
They had children.
Yeah, so this is really weird. This shows you that it was written by men. Because here's these 2 young girls, right? And by the way, their fiancés were burned up in the city too. The fiancé said, I'm going to stay back in Sodom. You guys can leave. And so they barely escaped this big. I mean, if that was a movie, you would need these special effects. That would be quite a movie, wouldn't it? The city's burning and they're just barely getting out in time. And then the wife turns around and turns into a geological feature right there on the ground. And so, what young woman would ever think this? Here they are escaping this whole thing. They've just seen their city destroyed. Their fiancés were killed. Their mother is dead, and they just got out of town. And then the first thing they say is, oh no, how is our father going to have heirs now that she's dead? And how in the world is our father going to be able to have offspring? We're going to have to get our dad drunk and sleep with our dad so that he can have offspring. That's the story in the Bible. And they did. And these are supposedly 2 young virgin girls who know exactly what to do to get a drunk dad, and so that both of them could get pregnant, so that Lot could now be a patriarch and have offspring. that whole three-part story of Sodom and Gomorrah, which is part 2, it is about homosexuality, but it's not really. The evil of homosexuality wasn't the sex act itself. It was the fact that they were not providing offspring for the patriarchs. Abraham needed to have a child, right, in the beginning. Lot needed to have a child through this whole thing. And so homosexuality interfered with inheritance rights and with offspring rights and with that whole patriarchal picture. It's a very patriarchal, sexist story when you think about it. It's all about how men can have their status, how men can be the procreators, how men can be the ones. And even the book of Job. I have a whole section in there on the book of Job. It's in the chapter capriciously malevolent. It's one thing to be malevolent, but capriciously malevolent, that's the phrase that Dawkins picked, means you're doing it for no reason at all. You're just doing it for fun. Like, I don't know, like people that bully other people or something, they're bullies. So the story of Job is probably the most curious book. In fact, some people debate whether it should even be in the Bible. You know the story. Satan came up to God. Somehow Satan and his friends are walking around heaven and they knock on the door, right? So God lets them in. That's however the story works. And God volunteers. He said, have you seen my servant Job? He's perfect. He's blameless. There's none like him. God was bragging. Hey, I got some really good followers here. This Job guy, he's great. He's righteous. He honors me. And Satan says, well, sure, because you're blessing him. Right? You built a hedge around him. You're blessed. You're taking care of him. You're providing for him. He had all this cattle. He had his wife. He had these children. He had all these wealth. Like the patriarch now has this great position in this society. And Satan said to God, if you take down the hedge, if you take away all those things, I bet you he won't worship you anymore. He's only worshiping you because you're being nice and good to him. But if you'd be bad to him, he won't worship you anymore. And what did God say? You're on.
Yeah.
You're on. All right, let's see if that's right, all right? So so Satan goes out under God's authority. By the way, the Bible says Satan can't do anything without God's permission.
Right.
And so Satan he killed the 10 children, he killed all the cattle, he made him sick, he did all these horrible things to Job with God's permission. By the way, you know how many people Satan is credited with killing in the entire Bible?
Not one.
8 or 9.
Just those 10.
Just those 10.
Oh.
And even those 10 were at God's permission. God saying, you're on, you do it, right? Otherwise he couldn't have done that. And yet look at how many deaths are credited to God directly himself. If nothing else, the flood, right? There might have been 20 million people on the planet at that time, including children and babies and pregnant women. They were all just killed in a big massacre. And then all sorts of other genocides in the Bible. So, but guess what? Job bit his tongue. He still remained, even though he lost all this stuff, he still remained faithful. And Satan came back to God, and God said, see, you were wrong. We took all the stuff away from him, and he still loves me, right? And Satan said, well, yeah, but you didn't touch him. You didn't touch his body. You didn't hurt him. I bet if you hurt his body, then he'll start cursing you. And what did God say? You're on. Do it. Go ahead and do it. So, so we know the story. And the second time Satan came back, I think this is one of the most damning verses in the entire Bible. Look it up. Job chapter 2, verse 3. Just remember that. Job 2:3, and look at it. God said to Satan, Job was blameless. Job was perfect and righteous. And yet you incited me to destroy him for no reason. Look at that verse. For no reason. God even admits it. For no reason. You made me destroy this man's life and torture him for no reason, without cause. Some translations say without cause. So who's the criminal? Suppose this violent rapist's murderer escaped from prison and comes up to your front door and says, hey, for some reason you open the door. Who are you? Hey, it looks like you have a nice family in there. Some really beautiful little children and some pets, and you have a really nice... And the guy says, yes, I go to church, I love God, I'm faithful in prayer, and I read the Bible, and yes, God has blessed my life. And the guy says, your children really love you, don't they? And you say, well, yeah, of course, I'm their father. And the guy says, well, you know what? If you let me in the house, I bet they won't love you anymore. I bet you they only love you because you're taking care of them, right? And then you say, you're on. You open the door and let the guy in the house. That's the same story, right? Who's the criminal? Who's the guilty? And you stand looking in the window to see what this person does to your family and, you know, to your children and to the pets and burns the house down and kills them all. And when the police arrive, the police ask you, why did you do that? I mean, you know, why did you do that? And you say, well, no reason. The devil made me do it, you know. Is that a reason? Is that good enough? That's capriciously malevolent, playing with human lives. There's very little respect for human life in the Bible. The Bible's all about God's life. Worship Him, bow to Him, fear Him. He's the big daddy. He's the authority. You need to not build any idols. In my next book that's coming out this fall, it's called Mere Morality. I have a section on, you get it, right?
C.S. Lewis, yes.
Yeah, you're a thinker. And my book 2 years ago is called Life-Driven Purpose.
Yeah.
You get it?
Yes.
Because Rick Warren had purpose-driven life.
Right.
If we could just turn things upside down and see the world in a different way. But in Mere Morality, I have a whole section that's coming out this fall where I went through the Bible, and the Bible doesn't use the word morality. The Bible doesn't use the word ethics. The Bible really doesn't give an ethical code or moral philosophy at all. It's all just obedience. Obey the dad, obey the father. It's really kind of a toddler morality. The way to be good is just do what daddy says. That's what good means. And so how do you know? One way to try to discern what is good and bad in the Bible is to look at the words wicked and evil. When I say the words wicked and evil, what images come to your mind? What do you think when I say those words?
Sex.
Sex? Oh, okay. Well, you would.
Murder.
But, yeah, murder.
Torture.
Torture. You think of horrible stuff, right? So I thought, well, let's look at what how the Bible describes and deals with the words wicked and evil. And approximately 5% of the time, I went through every instance in the Bible, about 5% of the time, the words wicked and evil are talking about people who are actually treating other human beings in a bad way. A little bit. What you and I might call morality. How do we treat other people, right? How do we minimize harm in the real world? But most of the time, more than 90% of the time, the words wicked and evil in the Bible have nothing to do with morality or human behavior toward other humans. They have to do with obeying God. The big one is idolatry, which is basically God's jealousy. And in the Ten Commandments, you even say it. My name is jealous. I'm a jealous God. You shouldn't look at any other person but me. Kind of like a controlling, abusive husband who tells his wife, I'm your husband, and you love me, and you love only me. And if you look at any other man, even sideways, I'm going to tear your eyes out. I'm going to spread dog poop on your face. I'm going to burn your desk. I'm not making this up, by the way. It's in the Bible. That stuff's in the Bible. If that woman, that possession of his, the Israelites were his chosen bride, if they even look at another god, if they even build an idol to them, pestilence and bloodshed and all the stuff that's going to happen to them, the punishments and the invasions that are going to happen. And even in Jeremiah, when the Israelites were complaining to God, why are the Babylonians attacking us? Why are they destroying us? And why are they raping our women? And that word is used. They lift up their skirts and they are violated. They are raped. Why is this happening? And God says, because you have forsaken me. You have not loved me. And when this happens to you, read this in Jeremiah 13. God said, I myself am lifting up your skirts. God himself says it. I'm the one who's raping you. It's not these soldiers that are coming in. I'm the one who's doing that to you. So we see that it's a jealous God in the Bible who wants his, he wants to be loved. Love in the Bible is not a mutual thing like we would think love is here among ourselves. Love is a top-down thing. You better love me or else. So we find this insecurity of this being who wants to be worshipped. If a kid's going to run out in the street, and the dad stops him and says, "Don't run out in the street," and the kid stops and says, "Why not? Why not, Daddy?" And the daddy says, "Because I said so. I'm your father. I'm the authority. You do what I say, or else you're in trouble." Is that the right answer? Why shouldn't the kid run out in the street? Yeah, there's danger. There's harm out in the street. That's what morality is. Morality is harm and trying to avoid harm. And if the father just ignores all that and says, because if you do it, if you disobey me, you have offended me and my holiness and my righteousness, and you've made me very angry, and I'm going to have to punish you for it. Is that a good way to be a dad? That's the dad of the Bible. You're going to be punished. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So much so that he had to shed blood. And there's a whole chapter called Bloodthirsty in the book about not just the animal blood that was being shed, where Solomon showed his love for God, that he killed 1,000 cows at once, right? That shows how much he loved God, that he killed 1,000 cows. They built all these animals so that blood, and the Bible talks about dipping their fingers in the blood and their hands in the blood and sprinkling the blood. And there's all this sprinkling of blood everywhere through there, because the Bible says without the shedding of blood, there's no remission of sins. Something's got to die, because God's so mad, something's got to die. So much that he even had to kill his own son in the New Testament. Blood had to be shed on the cross. That's morality. His anger is so fierce that something has to die. And that, and I used to preach, of course, that he died in our place. But the God of the Bible, if you just read it, and Dawkins and I and many other people are encouraging people, please read the Bible. Take it out of the drawer in the hotel room and open it and start reading it. Read what it says, please. How have we defaulted for asking people to please read this book that everyone says is the bestseller that everyone should find moral guidance in? So I think the more people who read the Bible, the more atheists there will be. And there are people who say that. There are, in fact, I quote, A.A. Milne, who wrote Winnie the Pooh, the author. He said he thinks the Old Testament is responsible for more atheism than any other literature ever written. And Isaac Asimov said, properly understood, the Bible is the most potent force for atheism. If people would just read it and open their eyes and see what it actually says, then we could discard the childishness, the toddler mentality of needing a Master, Lord, Savior, God above our lives to give us direction, because we're so stupid we wouldn't have figured out how to be moral on our own. So, in a nutshell, that's the book, God, the Most Unpleasant Character in All Fiction. I only touched on about 4 of them. If you want to maybe talk about some of the others, maybe about King Saul. How much time do we have here? We have some time, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
I'll do one more story, and then we can do questions. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
So, King Saul. Saul was the first king of the United Kingdom of the Jews way back. He was picked by God. He was anointed by the priest. And then Saul did something so horrible that God had to depose him. God had to kick him out. You're no longer fit to be the king. And then that's when David came in. You know that story? David then was chosen to replace Saul. If it wasn't for this one thing that Saul did, the Jews today would have a star of Saul, not a star of David. David was the plan B. David was the backup, because Saul was a really bad person. What do you think he did? It was so bad that he had to be kicked out. He couldn't be king anymore. What?
He let some of his enemies live and let some of the animals live.
Yeah, not even the enemies, just the animals. So yeah, he's right. Read the story. God had commanded Saul, and this isn't the first place, but he said, you need to go in and kill the Amalekites. This is ethnic cleansing genocide. Kill all of them, because this is the Holy Land. This is going to be my love nest for my bride, the Israelites, to come in here. And we need to clear it out of all these vermin, all these bad people. And by the way, the Canaanites were no worse than the Israelites. The Israelites also practiced child sacrifice, and the Israelites also did all these other things that supposedly the Canaanites were so guilty of doing. All those cultures in that time did it. And so God told Saul, go in and kill all the Amalekites. Don't leave alive anything that breathes. All the men, all the women, all the children, all the pregnant women, all the animals, everything. Kill everything out. So Saul went in and said, yes, I'm a good general. I'm going to go in and do that. So he went into the Amalekites, and the Israelites killed them all. They destroyed them all. Blood, everything was killed. All the men, women, children, everything, all the animals, except Saul decided to keep a few of the choice animals, the clean ones, alive, so that he could offer them as a sacrifice to God, to thank God, because he loved God, right? He wanted to leave these animals alive. He was going to kill them later, right, as a sacrifice. And so God got really angry at that. You disobeyed me. You didn't kill everything. You left a few animals alive. It didn't say how many, because I can hear their bleeding over there, right? So Samuel was saying that. God was talking through Samuel. And And Saul said, but I did obey. I did a complete genocide. There's nobody alive. There's just these few animals. And I was going to use them for sacrifice. And here's a verse in the Bible that gets quoted a lot. In fact, I used to quote it from the pulpit. Samson said to Saul, obedience is better than sacrifice. Obey. Do what I say completely. And Saul said, but he had a good reason, right? I think that's kind of a half-decent reason in that crazy morality back then. He was going to kill them later as a sacrifice. And God through Samuel said, that's not good enough. You're not good enough to be king. You didn't follow the orders. We're going to find somebody who is good enough to be king. And who did they find?
David.
King David. King David came along, and he became the total, absolute genocidal murderer. And God was happy with that, because in fact, the women were singing in the streets. Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his 10,000s. That's how you measured somebody's greatness, is how many people they killed by following orders. So Saul was killed because he didn't complete a genocide. Who do you think is the real criminal here? Where's the real crime in the story? This genocidal God who wants to clear out everybody who's bad, who don't obey him, because his glory, his holiness is very jealous, and you can only look at me and me only. So, and there's a lot more stories like that in the Bible, which is, I'm surprised, because I used to think I had read through the Bible when I was a preacher, but you kind of cherry pick. You never hear sermons about that. You rarely hear sermons about that from the pulpit. Most of it is, let your light shine before men and do good works and love Jesus and come to church. You basically hear the kind of Sunday morning mushy stuff, and most of those verses are ignored. The part about raping women, the part about aborting, the part about cannibalism, the part about pestilence and fire and all of that stuff. So I think this is just one way of showing not only that book was written by human beings that were flawed, they were projecting their own patriarchal fears and insecurities on their own God. They made a God in their own image, basically, the people who wrote that book. But I think it shows us that people today, and I think most Christians today, are much better than that. Most Christians are kinder than the God of the Bible. Most Christians are good people. Most Jews, most Muslims are decent, moral human beings because they're not using the Bible for their morality. They're using basic humanistic principles of treating each other with fairness and respect, and some human dignity, which you don't find in the Bible. The only dignity in the Bible goes to God. There's a few little exceptions here and there. So wicked and evil have more to do with idolatry, and intermarriage is another big one. And another big one, surprisingly, is not worshiping on the Sabbath. That's a big. If you didn't worship on the Sabbath, you will be stoned to death, you will be killed, there will be blood upon you. Those are how wickedness and evil are described in the Bible, not with human morality, but with obedience.
Also working on the Sabbath, that was a biggie.
Or working, yeah, okay. Or carrying something.
Yeah.
Well, you know the story in Numbers 15. The Israelites found a man, you know what they found a guy doing something really bad. You know that story?
Picking up sticks.
Yeah. It was Saturday, it was the Sabbath. They found a man picking up sticks. They didn't say why, but you can guess he was going to make a fire, I suppose. Maybe to feed his family or something. And this was a real theological dilemma for these people. We found a man picking up sticks on the Sabbath. What should we do? They brought him before Moses. Moses! He was picking up sticks. We saw it. What should we do? So Moses asked God, and Moses said, yep, he's got to die. This man had to be stoned to death because he picked up sticks on the Sabbath. Is that a good law? Is that moral? Is that something we should admire and respect? That kind of treatment? Of course, the Christian apologists say, well, those were tough times back then, and God was identified with the nation of Israel, and there was a wartime mentality, and for the morale of the troops, you couldn't allow somebody to go flouting the law just because they wanted to feed their family and pick up sticks. God had to be absolute about this, right? You hear the apologists making these arguments. Even if that's true, it's still bad. And you hear a lot of defenses of the God of the Bible, which actually don't defend anything. They basically end up agreeing that God was, in fact, genocidal, but he had a good reason for it. God did commit aborticide and kill babies and stuff, but he had a good reason for it. We don't understand the reason. It's because, and some apologists will even say, because God was trying to establish himself to the nation of Israel to have an heir through the line of David, which would end up in the moral arc resulting in the life and death of Jesus, who would pay the penalty for God's wrath, and then we could all go to heaven. So there was all this big aim for this whole picture. But tell that to the parents of a 3-year-old whose head's being cut off by these Israelite warriors coming in, committing genocide and murder. And when they ask, why are you doing this? This big Israelite warrior says, well, you have to consider this in the arc of the moral arc of history through God's plan to establish his nation, and someday, hundreds of years from now, Jesus will be born. So this is really a good thing that I am doing, because this is really a merciful thing, because otherwise this baby's going to grow up and be a really bad person. Assuming that nobody has a freedom of choice, that none of those children would have maybe grown up to rebel against their parents, that they all would have just been bad Canaanites because they were born Canaanites. Anyway, so I could talk forever, you can tell. So I think I'll just stop here at an awkward moment and then go into questions maybe. In the green back there, okay.
It sometimes happens that the people that I really care about, family or friends, they'll ask questions having nothing to do with faith or religion or any of that. Now I can see that my answer is going to lead us to that, right? Because at some point I'm going to have to unpack the different ways that we view the world. And I know that's going to bring that person frustration or anxiety or pain. And I guess the question is, I know, and I know that you know, it's really excruciating when you've been brought up to believe to let go of your faith. Is it always appropriate to broach that subject, to confront even obliquely someone else's faith as a bad thing, when it means just? I mean, you know, for example, I have an aunt who lost a son, and her faith brings her about the only peace on that matter that she can find. She talks about it all the time, and there's times when I don't say lots of things I would otherwise say, because I know that this conversation is going to lead down the road where I say this thing and this thing, you're going to get hurt. So the question is it? Do you think is there a time and place for talking about your lack of faith, or confronting someone else's faith as a bad thing?
Yeah, that's tricky, because especially if you live in a family where people don't agree on these things. And I think most atheists, including myself, have a live and let live attitude when it comes to belief. We don't care what people believe. We don't care if they want to go to church and stand on their head and pray to Mother Goose or whatever, you know. But if we call ourselves moral people, we do have something to say, not about belief, but about their actions. If their faith or their religion is causing actions that are causing harm, then we have every right as moral people to talk about that. For example, parents who refuse medical treatment to their children because of the Bible verse that says, is any sick among you? Let him come and have the elders anoint their head with oil, and the prayer of faith will heal the sick. And if parents believe that, we can let them believe that, but if they're going to harm their child, I think we or the state can and should step in to stop that bad religious action. So I doubt that your aunt or whoever that was is a bad person. I doubt that she's doing anything that you would say as a direct result of her faith is leading to some horrible action. In some cases it does. Most Christians are not. Most Christians are smarter and better than the Bible, and so why should we drag their... They don't even read it, so why should we force them to read that? Because they don't even believe it anyway. If they did, they would probably join us, right? But you might point out, if you're asked, if she ever asks you, well then that's different, right? If she were ever to come to you and ask you questions, that's different. You can then say, well, I had the door open to talk about this. I think in that case, you know, why cause trouble? I'm that way with my own relatives. You know, they find comfort in their faith. Of course, a lot of atheists and agnostics have children who die too, and parents and relatives, and they go through traumas as well. And we handle it without the so-called comfort of faith. We handle it our own ways. So I'm not going to give you any specific advice. Every family's different. In my mom and dad's case, they were asking me why I became an atheist. I started talking to them, and over a couple of years, then they both became atheists too, which is kind of cool. I tell that story in my book, Godless. It's usually the other way around, you know. Usually you don't want the kids, you know, but you never know. You never know what the person's going to be like in your family. You don't know how hard committed they are or how open they might be. So I would say just leave it be unless she brings it up. You know, that's my thought. Or unless she's giving money to some cause that's causing harm or something. Suppose she's donating to some, I don't know, group that's ends up oppressing people. You know, then you might want to say something about that.
Thank you.
There's this new string of thought going around, mostly with maybe like more conservative leaning people who maybe are not particularly religious, but they argue for, you know, the cultural Christianity and argue that Christianity has is what created kind of Western culture and Western values. So it's so even though they may not believe in literal interpretation, they still kind of defend the importance of religion in our culture. What would your response to that be?
It's probably true that some people benefit from having moral instruction in church. It's probably true. Church is not the only way to get it. You can get it other ways. But if your church is a vehicle that ends up doing good, and some churches are. Some churches march in the right marches. Some of them are liberal. Some of them are using their faith kind of as a metaphor, you know, like Martin Luther King Jr. talking about, let my people go, talking about Pharaoh and Egypt. So they're using those stories in the Bible to kind of relate to modern life. And there's some value in that, as long as they're admitting they don't really believe those stories actually happened. And we do know the Exodus did not happen. We do know that story is a total myth for a lot of reasons. But in any event, culture and poetry and art and all those kind of things, they're kind of mushy, aren't they? It's like everybody kind of has a different way of dealing with it. The Jews have a close-knit community where they love each other, care for each other, and they go out. Hardly any of the Jews, none of the Jews that I know actually believe in God. I don't know, the Orthodox probably do. One of my Jewish friends in Madison said, you know what you call a Jew who doesn't believe in God?
Jew.
A Jew, yeah. And I think it taps into this idea that anybody who's moral, for whatever reason, even if you're giving a religious reason, you're really using principles that transcend the religion, because you won't find those things in the Bible itself. There's a few places, take care of the widow and take care of the oppressed. You'll find some verses in the Bible, and you hear those from the pulpit a lot, right? You don't hear the blood and gore and fire and anger and wrath and jealousy verses that much. But you hear there's a few little verses in there, and that would be surprising if there weren't, because there were so many different writers over so many hundreds of years, and they all had different points of view. So you will find some good teachings in the Bible. Even Jesus said a couple of good things that I admire. I like the verse, test all things and hold fast to that which is true. I mean, that's kind of a good teaching. And Jesus even said, they who are healthy don't need the doctor. It's only they who are sick who need the doctor, right? And I think he's talking about us atheists. We don't need the religion. It's only the people who think they're sick who need the salvation. Those of us who don't have that negative self-image, So I don't know. I guess I don't know how to answer your question, except to say that if you do spot some actual harm in what their beliefs, if the beliefs lead to any harm, then maybe say something about that. But otherwise, who cares? It's a free country. So. Here's one here.
Hey, just want to let you know I'm a huge fan of yours.
Thanks.
When I became an atheist, that Godless book was one of the most helpful resources at the time, and I just loved it.
Wow.
And I remember you saying in the book that when you went through a similar process, there was really nothing for you to read. Yeah, you had a lot of like liberal Christian books that you read at the time of your deep conversion, but it was tougher at that time.
There was Bertrand Russell. He had his Why I'm Not a Christian.
Yeah.
That was available.
So I guess my question is, why is it so hard for people to read the Bible? And this is people that have read the Bible, like a lot of apologists. Why is it so hard for Christians to read the Bible and not see that it is so obviously man-made? I mean, man-made, that the God is man-made. I mean, it's everything, all the worst human characteristics. It's jealous, and it's angry, and it's vengeful, and it's capricious and genocidal. I don't see. It's hard for me to understand how you can't look at this and just see how obviously human in all the worst ways human that is. And that there's nothing about that God that couldn't have been written by, there's nothing it does that a human being couldn't have created in their mind. I mean, there's nothing about it that seems divine.
Unless you believe the miracle stories.
Right, but I mean, in terms of its character,
Yeah.
there's nothing about it. You know, and even the fact that it sends its son, that's the best plan, that it sends its own son to be, sacrificed. It's why do you think it's so hard for people to look at that? And even throughout the, because there's so many different authors that wrote the books, that the character changes depending on what book it is. Some books God is pretty nice and loving, other books he's pretty evil. And it just kind of depends on which book you're reading, and the character seems incompatible throughout the whole arc of the Bible. Why do you think it's so hard for people to look at that and see this is a very man-made kind of creation? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I have my own thoughts, and I don't speak for all atheists or all scholars, obviously. But I kind of think it's biological. I think it goes back to our tribal ancestry of the big man, the leader. You look at other primate cultures, you have the big alpha male who controls all the territory, all the resources, all the females, and the beta male and the males lower have to kind of reach their hands up to get something from this big man. And you see that in human cultures as well. The big man cultures in a lot of countries where there's this king, monarch, deity, person. And we probably evolved through that tribal culture for our own well-being to give respect to that big man, right, who's up there. Or our father or our mother, the parental figure. And so that comes into our allegiance to sports teams, for example. I mean, how rational is that? You're rooting for a team, and it means everything to you. Most of those players aren't even from your own state. There's something about us that wants to be, and football and all that kind of harkens back to that tribal, we want to, all the words we use. So I think biologically we have some instincts in us that defends, don't say anything bad about the big man, and so it's an a priori thing that happens. And if you read a lot of the literature that defends the God of the Bible, or that tries to explain away the Bible contradictions, they almost always start by saying, since we know the Bible is perfect and inerrant, then here's the reasons. You can always come up with a reason. If it's your starting point, you already made your conclusion in advance. The Bible is perfect and inerrant, it has no errors, and it's inspired by God. Well, then of course you've got to find some reason, some rationalization to make these apparent contradictions or ugliness disappear. And maybe loyalty is part of that, or maybe, my dad's he just died a couple years ago, but he was a wonderful guy, gentle, smart, funny, and I don't know everything about his life. It's possible that he had a secret life where he was this serial killer or something, I don't know. But right now I'm going to go with it. He's my dad. And if somebody says something bad about my dad, what's the immediate thing that happens to you? Yeah, you defend, right? You're on this is my dad, this is my family, this is my tribe, this is my culture, this is my religion. So it's almost a blind spot, and the religious commitment compromises moral judgment. It's almost like allegiance to a political leader. You're going to be with that leader. And look at how the religious right is attached to some pretty despicable political leaders right now. When I was an evangelical minister, I used to preach that character counts. And now it doesn't seem to count at all in our political process. It seems to be that politics is what counts. But so there's something in human nature that I think is biological. I think we just knee-jerk defend our family, our tribe, our group, our team, our whatever it is, our religion, against no matter what. Loyalty is important. And you even hear that in a lot of political parties. Are you loyal or aren't you? Where the question should be, is this right or is it wrong? Or is this good or is this bad? So I'm just kind of guessing. I think that plays into why people don't even consider the possibility that they should back up and be critical about what they believe. They've already committed themselves. They're already past that door. They're inside the team and they're already defending it. It's really hard to step outside. And yet every Christian in America would applaud loudly if they saw some Muslim in Baghdad do that. If they saw a Muslim over there question their culture, stand up and rise up and rebel against that culture and say, well, I'm going to think for myself, and if they were to leave Islam, Christians would go, good for you, good for you. You're thinking for yourself. You're not just following blindly. And yet when one of us does it here, we get denounced for that, right? When one of us does the very same thing, we're traitors to the religion, or we're even traitors to our country. Or if you're a person of color, like if you're part of the Black Atheist movement, they even feel like traitors to their race. Even their families tell them that.
Yeah.
How can you be a Black atheist? You're a traitor to the race. They even hear them say that, which is weird, right? Thoughts should be thoughts. In the very back, in the blue there, okay.
So I mean, you've talked a lot about morality and like good moral person, and you even said that morality transcends religion. Well, where is that? How are you defining morality? Is I guess what are you meaning by moral?
Yeah.
And where is that coming from? If it's transcendental to man-made thought, as you're saying originally.
Yeah, so my next book is all about that, called Mere Morality. You know how C.S. Lewis tried to strip down Christianity to the core, mere Christianity. What is it about Christianity that we all share in common, regardless of our differences?